Welcome to our GLC set review for the Mega Evolution set, releasing internationally on September 26th. This set is all about the amazing, creative, innovative, brand new mechanic of Mega Evolutions. Will Mega Evolutions be any good in Gym Leader Challenge? Okay, no, actually, since there are rule boxes and not allowed in GLC. But that's okay, because the new Mega Evolution mechanic is an incredibly boring rehash of a 3-prize EX Pokemon that don't even actually evolve from the Pokemon they're supposed to. So, we can happily ignore these cards and their dedicated support for this set review. What this set does have for GLC is some incredible, game-breaking new support for types like Fighting and Grass, which lately have been struggling in the format and feels like they've been left behind somewhat. So I'm really glad to see that the Pokemon Company is finally spreading some type-based, non-rule box support to types other than just Colorless and Psychic, as we're also going to be seeing some awesome new support for the Fire and Darkness types coming up in Phantasmal Flame set after this one. But Mega Evolution is the next set coming out, so that's the set we'll be talking about. For all my set reviews, I give a card a rating from 1 to 5 based on how good I think it is, which I'll flash on the screen, or you can click on the Google Doc in the description to see each of the reviewed cards' ratings, as well as the script for this video. For this review, I'll be categorizing cards based on the type that they support, rather than by their actual printed card type or the set number. So I'll be starting off with typeless cards that go in any deck, and then moving on to fighting cards, grass cards, etc. So starting off with Lily's Determination, a new supporter, basically an upgraded Cynthia that can draw you 8 cards in the early game and otherwise 6 cards if you have less than 6 prizes remaining. This card is probably the most powerful draw supporter the game has seen in recent years and should likely be played in every deck in the format. It's basically the opposite of Colress, a card that can also shuffle and draw 8 cards or more, but only after both players have mostly fully set up. So that makes Colress better in the late game when you're already set up and you don't need the cards as much, while Lily is giving you that massive spike in card draw right from the start of the game when you really need it most to help you get set up. And it's going to help you find all your pieces to get your setup going. It's funny that even though I see a lot of decks in GLC now cutting Cynthia to play more targeted search supporters that either search out specific cards or accelerate energy, I think even those decks will want to make room for Lily. The card is just so incredibly powerful, especially in those crucial early turns where a lot of GLC decks can sometimes find themselves struggling to get their setup going. Next up, we have Lieutenant Surge's Deal. This is a bizarre card that is actually a callback all the way to Gym Heroes in the WotC era days, and the card Lieutenant Surge's Treaty, where it was effectively an item that did the same thing, but only drew 1 card as a secondary mode. And now we have it as a supporter that will draw you 4 cards if your opponent doesn't take the deal, where you both take a prize. When I first got into Magic the Gathering way back in the day, there was a new set that had just come out, and it had a mechanic on its creatures where their creatures would come into play and your opponent would choose between either having that creature be bigger, more stats, or having it do a negative effect to them, like destroying one of their artifacts or something like that. So players learned quickly that everything that had that mechanic on it, every card was terrible, because the opponent would always just choose the option that didn't matter to them in that specific situation. And it's going to be really hard to evaluate what this card is going to do in a similar way when you put it in your deck, because its effect is completely reliant on the whims of your opponent. I've heard a lot of players talking about this card saying you can basically just treat this as a straight up draw 4 card supporter, because no opponent is going to ever let you take a prize card with this. But I would caution against such generalizations. If you're behind on prizes, this card actually just becomes a blank, because if you play it, your opponent will just take the prize happily, hastening your defeat while giving both players 1 extra card. If you really are just looking for a supporter that will draw you 4 cards, there are already much better options in the format that are available that can do that without giving your opponent the chance to blank your supporter for the turn. And if you think you're ever going to take a prize with this when it would actually benefit you, you're basically already winning, because that means your opponent is making bad choices. Next up, we have Dangerous Ruins. This is a new and improved version of Gapejaw Bog and Team Magma's Hideout. Well, unless you're playing Darkness Pokemon. and I'll explain in a second. So this, unlike Gapejaw Bog, this now catches any Pokemon that hits the bench from anywhere, not just ones that come down from the hand. So Pokemon that come into play with something like a Nest Ball or Buddy Buddy Poffin or Call for Family, even something that comes up from the discard pile with something like Revive, will also take the 20 damage. And this is great because not only does that mean your opponent won't be able to avoid the damage as easily when using those cards, you can also use these cards and still benefit from the self-damaging effect of this stadium. That way you can trigger whatever damage-based effects you're trying to pull off. And funnily enough, despite the fact that this seems like it was meant to be a darkness support card, since it doesn't affect darkness Pokemon, this card actually works the least well with darkness decks, because if you're putting this card into your deck, it's probably because you're trying to create synergy with other card effects that want you to have damage on your own Pokemon, things like Moltres, Hisuian Arcanine, Drampa, Spiritomb, etc. And so you won't be able to do that in your darkness deck. All right, moving into the type-specific cards from the set, starting off with Fighting. And Fighting is getting some insane new support in this set, and while Mega Lucario might be the centerpiece of the type in the main set, for GLC, Lunatone is the true star of this fight show. Lunatone gives Fighting something it has lacked for a long time, a repeatable draw engine on a Pokemon. And this is a really cool one too, as it's a super powerful draw effect equal to something like Salazzle or Revavroom, but it's on a basic Pokemon, so you can start using it as early as your first turn going first. But the catch is that you need another specific basic Pokemon in play, which is any Solrock. This means it's not going to be as simple as just playing a Nest Ball, and since this has 110 HP, you also can't just Buddy Buddy Poffin for both rocks either. But with cards that can get multiple basic Pokemon into play early, like Battle VIP Pass, Gloria, and Brooklet Hill, it's really not that hard to find both. It does make prizing and bench space a bit more of an issue, but these are easy trade-offs for such a powerful draw ability. As far as Parallel City, just imagine you discard your Lunatone and Solrock to your opponent's Parallel City, then next turn you bump their Parallel City and you play Clara, you get back both of your rocks onto your bench, plus an energy to pitch to the Lunatone and an energy to attach to one of your Pokemon. It's that crazy. It cannot be understated how powerful it is to have a draw ability like this on a basic Pokemon rather than being on a stage 1 like in most other types. It means that you can get your draw engine back online immediately if it gets taken out for some reason, versus other decks that have to evolve up, usually takes an extra turn. That's a turn lost of drawing cards. Putting energy into the discard pile also synergizes perfectly with both Garganacl and Colossal, but the early consensus seems to be that Garganacl is the way to go, since Lunatone can only discard basic fighting energy, and Colossal's fire energy requirements are competing with the rainbow energy slots needed to power up Okidogi's ability, which has become a staple in fighting decks. Again, I cannot understate what a massive game changer this Lunatone is going to be for fighting decks. It has felt insane to me goldfishing with this card in fighting decks and just having huge hands flushed with cards every turn compared to how fighting usually plays. And then of course we have to talk about the Solrock, and as mentioned, Lunatone requires a Solrock to be in play to use its ability. And while there are a few options already available, this set provides a new Solrock, and it is a banger. 1 energy to do 70 damage to the active Pokemon, ignoring weakness and resistance, is a very aggressive attack, putting pressure on almost all evolving basics in the format, reminiscent of the early game pressure that Fan Rotom and Zapdos are able to apply in the early game in those types. In fact, with the 3 new cards you get from the Lunatone, it's tempting for me to compare the impact of Solrock and Lunatone in fighting to what Fan Rotom did in Colorless. And ignoring resistance is especially nice, as it lets you even take KOs against many of the psychic and colorless evolving basics that would otherwise be able to survive this attack, including the Fan Rotom itself. I should also point out that 110 HP on both Solrock and Lunatone, while not poffinable or level ball searchable, is actually still kind of beneficial, as it gives them a lot of HP to survive certain spread breakpoints, like taking 2 spread attacks from Electivire and surviving a 3 energy snipe from Raging Bolt, and surviving the smaller attacks from early pressure Pokemon that I mentioned, like Fan Rotom and Zapdos. And to make sure fighting is able to find Lunatone and Solrock and the energy to use their abilities, Fighting is also getting its own version of Fog Crystal in Fighting Bell or Fighting Gong, whichever they decide to translate it as. This is another card that feels just such a great addition to the fighting type. And when I've been playtesting the new cards in my decks, it basically either finds the missing sun or moon, or finds the energy you need if you already have both. Every Psychic deck plays Fog Crystal, and I think pretty much every fighting deck will be including this card going forward. And Fighting also gets an Electro Power in Premium Power Pro, an item that boosts fighting Pokemon's attacks by 30 damage for 1 turn. This is a welcome card in probably most fighting decks, although I could see some fighting decks choosing to cut this just because Fighting already has access to a lot of good damage boosting effects in Strong Energy, Muscle Band, and Grant. But even when your main attacker is something like Okidogi, sometimes 170 damage isn't enough to get the job done on certain stage 2s. And many of Fighting's other attackers are also often doing lower than average damage in exchange for having much lower energy costs. And of course, you always have to consider resistance when you're dealing with Fighting. That can also throw off your math. So having access to a card like this, especially that one that is searchable off of Karina, is really nice. I think most fighting decks will include this card to make sure their attacks are dealing enough damage to take KOs and hit those certain breakpoints when they need to. Next up, we're going to be looking at the actual fighting Pokemon other than the Solrock and Lunatone. We've got Hariyama, a gust on a stick with a big attack to boot. Hariyama feels very similar to Hop's Double, and although it hits much harder, it's also much harder to power this up compared to Double in Colorless, which benefits from cards like Ignition Energy and Hop's Choice Band. I also feel like Colorless can make much better use of cards like Scoop Up Net and Devolution Spray to reuse their Double's ability. You can of course use Reversal Energy to power this up, and you can find both of those cards with Hilda, but it feels like this is going to be a much stronger play in Standard, where old Yamasan can prey on the 2 prize Pokemon with 210 HP like Pheasantipity and Ogerpon for those multi-prize knockouts. All that being said, you could just use Hilda to get this card and then get a Rainbow Energy to attack with your Okidogi. You don't have to attack with Hariyama specifically on the turn you use its ability. It should be mentioned also there is a 70 HP Makuhita from Boundaries Crossed that is Puffin searchable, so keep that in mind. I think the debate players are going to have is whether it's better to play this card or the Tinglu from Paradox Rift. Tinglu is lower maintenance as a basic Pokemon, hits harder for the same amount of energy, and is able to hit the 240 magic damage number with either a Strong Energy or a Muscle Band, and it also has a helpful secondary setup attack, but it can sometimes be crippled by residual damage in certain matchups. Hariyama is generally inferior to Tinglu, except that it has that one-time Gust ability to help target down a key Pokemon and disrupt the opponent. I think for me, the Tinglu wins out in this fight, but it may be that the ability to gust up a target while playing another supporter for the turn is strong enough to justify Hariyama as a stage 1. Next up, we have Marshadow, and I've seen a lot of excitement about this card early on in the spoiler season, but I have had enough of my Garchomp Sonic Slips countered to not be super impressed by this. Yes, there's lots of ways in fighting to boost your damage to make this attack stick and take a knockout, but for 2 energy, 60 damage is just such a low starting point to have to get a KO from to be able to get this effect to go off. And by the way, I should mention, if you get a KO with this Marshadow for 60 damage, you are immune to damage and effects of attacks for 1 turn. There's just so many ways to get around this kind of effect. You can Boss, Guzma, Escape Rope, Snipe the bench. Having any Pokemon with more than 80 HP in play will do it. So consider it in a fighting spread deck. If you can spread a bunch of damage, you could theoretically go pop, 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 finish off a bunch of things with this attack and have it be completely immune to damage. Next up, we have Garganacl, and this Garganacl gives all of your fighting attacks an extra 30 damage boost. And as a former Earthquake fighting player, I was super excited when I saw this card spoiled. This plus Premium Power Pro seemed like the power boost that Donphan and Hisuian Arcanine and gang needed to finally break through the metagame and be able to consistently take knockouts. But now that we've gotten Lunatone spoiled, it just seems like there's no point in trying to make a low-to-the-ground Pokestop fighting deck work. We can just draw cards with Lunatone and accelerate energy with Energizing Rock Salt Knackle to better attackers. Now, unfortunately, I think the energy version of Garganacl will end up being the superior Salt Lord for fighting decks to run over this version. Next up, we are moving into the grass type, which got quite the bombshell dropped on the format with the announcement of Vitality Forest, or Lush Forest, again, depending on what the translation will be, an almost reprint of the banned Forest of Giant Plants. You can evolve all your grass Pokemon instantly from your hand without needing to wait a turn, with the only restriction being that you can't use the effect on your first turn. I think a lot of people were rightfully concerned when this card got spoiled, but I also think Mahone did the right thing by not hastily banning this card before we could see what it could do in a 2025 GLC metagame. A much different metagame than when Forest of Giant Plants got banned back in 2022. While it seems like Vitality Forest will enable all kinds of broken, explosive evolution turns, the reality is that you need to actually have all these evolutions in your hand already the turn you play Vitality Forest if you want to benefit from its effect. For context, in order to evolve 2 Stage 2 lines in one turn, you need 6 specific Pokemon cards in your hand in addition to the forest itself, a 7-card combo, all of which are one-ofs. Also important to remember that you can't use Rare Candy with Vitality Forest because of the hard restriction printed onto Rare Candy that says you can't use it on a basic Pokemon that just came into play, which overrides the effect of the stadium. So you need a way to get a bunch of specific Pokemon into your hand the turn you play it, the turn you play the forest, which is not easy for grass, as grass still doesn't have a great draw engine outside of the Stage 2 Beautifly. But luckily, Lily's Determination plus Le Parfum Roserade more or less solves that problem, and when I've tested the deck, I basically just use Roserade to find either Lily or Colress to completely refill my hand, and then I evolve all the Pokemon I draw with it using the Vitality Forest, and it's pretty awesome. And then the cool stuff is that you can do with the evolutions you already have in play with cards like Scoop Up Net and Devolution Spray. It's so cool. With Forest in play alongside an evolution with a once per turn ability, you can now reuse that ability instantly with a Scoop Up Net or Devo Spray. These item cards suddenly become items that say get any card from your deck, or accelerate 2 grass energy from your deck, etc. So that makes the forest really powerful in that way. And additionally, it becomes way faster to recover your discarded evolutions. One Lana's Aid with Forest of Vitality in play, and suddenly your KO'd Stage 2 is fully back in action like it never left. You also get a lot more value out of cards like Arizu and attacks like Pack Call and Bug Hunch to fill your hand with evolutions, and then be able to dump them all into play immediately the next turn if you don't get hit with hand disruption. Again, though, all of these things are very card intensive, so you have to have all the pieces together to make them work, which still makes grass very susceptible to hand disruption as well as ability lock. I think the new forest is a great new toy for grass to build around, and one that it very much needed to stay relevant, as it was definitely falling behind the other types. But I don't think it's going to actually be as broken the way that many people think it will be, but only time and tournaments will tell. Next, we come on our first grass Pokemon, Meganium. Basically an improved Jungle Totem Venusaur, which will double all of your basic grass energy in play. But this time, this version can actually threaten big basics by doing 140 damage for effectively 2 energy if its ability is turned on. And 2 retreat means that you can't find it with a heavy ball like Venusaur, but it also means that you can much more effectively use Air Balloon as a second pivot tool, and it means it can basically retreat for 1 energy thanks to its ability. And no, these effects don't stack with the other Venusaur. The ability only affects basic energies, so once you double it, it doesn't double it into 2 basic energy that you then would double again. I think unless you really love Venusaur, it makes sense to just swap in Meganium in any deck that was playing Jungle Totem Venusaur. And next I want to talk about this Exeggutor. Exeggutor features an improved version of the Grass Whip attack. So for 3 energy, it's hitting 150. And with an energy doubler like Meganium, it will do 180 damage for 2 energy attached. And with an energy doubler with 3 energy attached, it will hit for 240, which is a magic number right now in GLC because of Wailord. Also worth noting that there's a few good executes legal in the format, but I think the really good one is from way back in Black and White, a 30 HP execute which can put itself back into your hand from the discard pile, and you can do that actually as many times as you want, because even though it says once per turn, the ability resets when it moves from your discard pile into your hand. This card is super broken in that you can just discard it to a bunch of things like Quick Ball and Ultra Ball, put it back into your hand over and over. You could get it with the battle compressor and then put it right back into your hand. It doesn't even put itself on the bench. It puts itself back into your hand. With this Execute and the Vitality Forest, letting you evolve immediately, I feel like this Exeggutor could actually feel almost like a basic attacker and less like a stage 1, but I could see this absolutely having a spot in the grass deck. And then for my last grass card, I just quickly want to talk about the Celebi in this set. 80 HP basic, that for 1 energy you can get 3 in any combination of grass Pokemon and stadiums from your deck and put them into your hand. Now, I mentioned that cards like Pack Call and Bug Hunch that can get you 3 Pokemon on attack, very valuable with Vitality Forest, since it fills up your hand with the evolutions that you want to play that you can all then evolve immediately. Celebi also does that, but it can also get you the Forest, the Vitality Forest as well, with that attack. So kind of nice. I don't know if this is worth it. I have added the Kricketune to my grass deck, mostly just because I want that Bug Hunch attack. Is really useful, but the Kricketune has that useful ability that gives you plus 40 HP, makes your Pokemon much bulkier. I don't know if it's worth running this over that, because you save a deck slot with the Celebi, but then the problem is the Celebi doesn't do anything useful after that, whereas the Kricketot with the Bug Hunch attack then evolves into Kricketune, which gives you that extra bulk. Plus, this is not Buddy Poffin findable because of the 80 HP, so I don't know. Maybe this is worth it, maybe not. I don't think so. My gut is telling me you should just play the Kricketune if you're going to try and add an attack like this. But I thought it was worth mentioning. All right, and that moves us into Psychic. And Psychic is also getting support in this set. Psychic doesn't really need the support, but whatever. It's fine. So Psychic gets Mystery Garden. So this is a stadium that lets you discard an energy to draw cards until you have cards in your hand equal to the number of Psychic Pokemon you have in play. So for example, if you've got 6 Psychic Pokemon in play, you get to draw cards until you have 6 cards in your hand. I think this card is obviously super powerful new tool for Psychic. I think most Psychic decks will definitely run this. It does compete with Dimension Valley and Parallel City, but I know a lot of Psychic decks also run cards like Tropical Beach and Cleffa to draw cards in the early game. And I think Mystery Garden will easily replace some of those cards. This is a card that helps with hand size manipulation for Iron Boulder and just gives Psychic that extra boost in the late game to find the cards it needs. It is important to note that this card is similar to Colress in that it's not as good in the early game for setting up. You really want to have a very full bench and be drawing up to 5 or 6 cards with this, so it might be good to include more ways to fill up your bench with basics in the early game. And speaking of which, we have Xerneas, a 120 HP basic that has the Geogate attack, which can bench 3 basic Pokemon from your deck for a single Psychic energy, as well as a passable 120 damage attack for 3 energy. This card looks mediocre in terms of its stats for a big basic, but Psychic is a deck that often runs a lot of evolution lines and often feels like it can have a hard time setting up. And being able to pull 3 basics out of your deck for a single energy seems quite good at fixing that problem, as well as giving you a quick way to fill your bench to draw more cards with Mystery Garden. 120 damage is also not nothing, as we've seen with cards like Iron Crown and Metal decks recently. It can bully smaller basics and support Pokemon, and with a Muscle Band, Giratina, or Monkey Dory damage, can take out big basics as well. Look, it's no Hisuian Basculin, but it certainly has potential. Just a thought, I should also mention that this set has a really good new Ralts option as well, since almost every Psychic deck plays the Curlia Gallade evolution line. And this one has the gold standard 70 HP for surviving Raging Bolt attacks, and 1 retreat for early game flexibility. And it has the Collect attack to draw a card, even for a colorless energy, such as Capture Energy or Counter Energy in the early game. So worth considering as your new Ralts. Suspicious Clock is the other trainer support card for Psychic, and it is basically just a reprint of Devolution Spray. With both Scoop Up Net and Devo Spray already available in the format, there's not really much need for this card, but I suppose you could run it as your 3rd copy and maybe combo them with some of the Pokemon we're about to talk about next. Kadabra and Alakazam have the Psychic Draw ability that lets you draw 2 and 3 cards respectively when you play these cards from your hand to evolve them. Alakazam for 1 energy can place damage counters on the opponent's active Pokemon equal to twice the amount of cards in your hand. As mentioned, you can combo these with cards like Scoop of Net and Devolution Spray to get additional value, but the problem with using abilities like these as your card draw engine is that since they're not repeatable, they leave you vulnerable to hand disruption like Iono and N. Alakazam does have an okay attack if you can amass enough cards in your hand, and even places damage counters, which can avoid certain revenge attacks and damage reduction abilities. But ending the turn with a huge hand is not ideal since you couldn't play any of the cards that you had to hold on to, and it leaves you even more vulnerable to a devastating Iono. Unfortunately, I don't think this will be Alakazam's breakout card in GLC. But another card you can mess around with Devolution strats is the new Grumpig, which lets you look at the top 4 cards of your deck and attach any basic energy you find there to your Pokemon in any way you like, but only when you play it from your hand to evolve it. The fact that it can only attach basic energy cards is a major blow, as Psychic really likes to play special energies, and the fact that it's single use and can easily whiff makes this really unappealing, especially when Metang can do this every turn in Metal. Despite how much I do love Grumpig, get out of here, Oinkalone, Grumpig is the only pig for me. Moving on to Water. And the new support card for the water type is the Surfing Beach, a stadium that lets you switch your water Pokemon to the bench once each turn. This is a great stadium to have mainly in 2 types of water decks. One is the obvious Palafin deck, which requires switching cards and is getting a new Pokemon for it in this set, but also any water deck that is relying solely on Frosmoth for energy acceleration, as Frosmoth can only accelerate energy to bench Pokemon. Also worth noting that if you're willing to include the Lusamine and Sinlin combo in your deck, this gives you an infinite out to being boss trapped, which seems like a really nice feature against any control deck. I was actually going to say this card seems niche at first, but honestly with Water not really having a super critical stadium that it needs to play other than Brooklet Hill, Rough Seas, and maybe Chaotic Swell, I could see Surfing Beach being a great pivot tool for any water deck to consider running. Next up is Clawitzer, a stage 1 that can accelerate 2 water energy to itself from the hand whenever it switches from the active to the bench, and for 3 energy it does 210 damage, but has to discard all energy. Obvious inclusion in the pivot water deck with Palafin, but I actually wonder if Palafin isn't just better than this in every way. Palafin does the same damage, requires less energy overall, doesn't discard its energy, can be powered up more easily with cards like Aqua Patch and Raihan, and with a Pot Helmet can actually tank an attack with 150 HP, compared to this only having 130. Also, it has a superior spread of evolving basics that it can evolve from. Yeah, as I'm writing this is looking less and less appealing than just recurring Palafin instead. Then we have a new Kyogre to compete with Dynamic Wave. This one does 3 energy for 130, but you have to discard 2 energy, so not great. But the first attack, Riptide, an attack that calls back to the broken Neo Genesis for Alligator, for you old heads, for 1 energy does 20 damage for each water energy in your discard pile, and then shuffles them back into the deck. A lot of Hydro Pump decks can quickly find themselves running out of energy to pay their attackers very expensive Hydro Pump attack costs, and this replenishes your energy resources while serving as a low-cost basic attacker in the process. I've seen decks with Gather the Crew, Hisuian Basculin, also running the Bascule Legion with the same attack as this Kyogre, and I wonder if it wouldn't just be better to play this instead of the Bascule Legion. The whole point of Basculin, after all, is to have it sit in the active spot in the early game and get knocked out. So it seems like having your energy recycle attacker be a basic instead of having it evolve from your sacrificial Pokemon that you want to get knocked out early would make sense. Also, I think in most Rain Dance decks, the Dynamic Wave Kyogre is just too broken not to run. But if you're only packing Frosmoth as your main or only Rain Dancer, which cannot power up Dynamic Wave's Kyogre after it attacks, this Kyogre seems like a solid option for a late game attacker. Then we have this Inteleon. It was a little too interesting not to call out. For 1 energy, it straight up knocks out the Pokemon in play with the lowest remaining HP, and if it's a tie, it is your choice, but that includes your Pokemon as well. And something interesting I've learned is that if the Pokemon with the lowest remaining HP has a Mist energy attached to it, or a Wash energy, you'll actually KO the Pokemon with the next lowest remaining HP. which I would have thought would just bounce off the Mist Energy and do nothing. But yeah, Mist Energy excludes that Pokemon from the effect altogether. But yeah, Shady Dealings Inteleon is a card, and it's a broken card. There's no way you're ever cutting that for this weird attacker. And then finally in water, we talked about Frosmoth a lot, and there is a new Frosmoth in this set that might actually be worth playing over its Ice Dance predecessor, specifically in water spread decks. For 1 energy, this moth deals 20 damage to each of your opponent's Pokemon, but it also puts the opponent's active Pokemon to sleep, giving you a nice chance of stalling out the opponent's attacker while you spread more damage. This definitely seems like a solid inclusion in any water spread deck unless you are really reliant on the Ice Dance Frosmoth. But of course, have access to other Rain Dancers in water that you could use instead of Frosmoth. And that moves us into Metal, and there's really only 2 cards I want to talk about for Metal. First is the dedicated Metal support card, Iron Defender. Yet another callback to a WotC era card. This is similar to Premium Power Pro and Electro Power, but in reverse. An item that gives all your Metal Pokemon a 30 damage defensive buff during your opponent's next turn. And just like those items, it works on a Pokemon that comes into play even after the item is played. So for instance, you could play this, play Research, draw into a basic Metal Pokemon, put it on the bench, and that new Pokemon will benefit from the defense boost on the next turn. And this also protects your bench Pokemon as well from bench damage. Problem is that right now, Metal is just not hurting for cards that give a 30 damage defense bonus between Full Metal Lab, Metal Goggles, all the rest of them. It doesn't even run all the damage reducing cards most of the time. And with this item being a temporary buff compared to the more permanent damage reductions that are available to Metal, also being an item makes it way harder to recur compared to a Stadium or a Tool. I just don't see it being that useful. It even has a stronger temporary defense buff to compete with in the Metal Core Barrier. And Dialga is the only Pokemon I think is worth talking about in Metal. The Tinkaton line introduced in this set is kind of trash, but feel free to tell me in the comments why Tinkaton is worth playing in Metal. But anyway, Dialga is really interesting to me. 160 damage for 3 energy. It's kind of the gold standard for a big basic attacker right now, and this one does it at the cost of shuffling all energy attached to it into the deck. Now, that might seem like a steep drawback, but I see cards like this as preserving their energy, putting it back into the deck for when they get return KO'd. You'd rather have the energy in your deck than on the Pokemon when it gets KO'd. And that can be really useful and easy to get around with cards like Metang. So if it goes back in the deck, you can get back out with Metang. You also don't have to return the energy, and if you don't, say because you got an early head start, your opponent's board isn't threatening a return KO, 80 damage is actually a solid number to bully opponents' boards in the early game where they might only have evolving basics in play. So you could totally keep your energy to be able to take multiple knockouts in the early game against a stumbling opponent. Now obviously the main comparison here will be to the Heatran that can do 160 damage with a fire energy attached. However, there's an argument to be made that including fire energy for that card does dilute your metal energy count for Metang. The bigger competition is with the Celebrations Dialga, which has a much weaker attack in my opinion, doing 120 for 3 damage or 140 for 4, as there's no metal energy doublers that can really power that up. But the Temporal Backflow attack is very strong in its own right to recover powerful one-off cards like special energies, tools, and items that are otherwise not easy to recover from the discard pile. And moving on to Fire, and unfortunately we don't have much going on in the set for Fire, but hopefully exciting things are coming in the next set. And actually the card I'm most excited about from this set is this Numel. There's actually multiple playable Camerupt in GLC, one that can do 240 by discarding a fighting energy, one that can spread 50 damage to 2 targets. And this Numel offers a great consistency option for helping you set up your bench. It does kind of suck that it still isn't Poffin searchable, but at least this one has 2 retreat instead of 3, though that also isn't super ideal for your setup attacker. But yeah, if your deck is playing Camerupt, you get a sweet new Numel to play with and set up your bench. This Volcanion is worth calling out as a potential early game attacker in Embor Fandango decks. since you can just put all the energy back onto it, since it has to return 2 energy to your hand to attack for 130 damage. Fire is still sorely lacking in big basics that can hit hard in the early game. But this Volcanion might do the trick, and it has the same energy preserving trick that by now you guys know I'm fond of, returning energy to the hand, which works nicely with Inferno Fandango Embor. Interestingly, if this translation is correct, then with Charizard in play, you should be able to return just a single fire energy card to meet the requirements for the attack. So 2 energy to attack, put 1 energy back into your hand. 130 is good early game damage, but it will fall off in the late game. So I feel like this would pair well with something like Silver Tempest Rapidash or the new Volcarona to give it a damage boost. But if you're playing Fire, you also likely have Gouging Fire, and that can handle the bigger threats later in the game that Volcanion cannot. And finally for Fire, we have Cinderace, and as cool as this kind of effect is, it's just not good in a singleton format like GLC. Furthermore, this Cinderace's attack is easily replicated by cards like Flare Starter Volcanion and TM Turbo Energize, which are much easier to get into play on turn 1 than this card. And finally, the thing that really holds this card back is how good Libero Cinderace is. If you're going to play a Cinderace, that's the one you want to play in GLC. Moving on to Darkness, we really don't have much for this set. This Yveltal has free retreat and has a trapping attack for 1 energy. Nice option for Darkness decks that want to have a pivot and possibly looking to stall something in the active. Though I think the free retreat Yveltal that discards a special energy may be the stronger option in a meta that is currently being overrun by Okidogi and Dragobox. And since we have such slim pickings for Darkness, I thought I would just talk about this Crawdaunt, specifically in relation to cards that aren't out yet, but that were spoiled for the next set. Crawdaunt is technically not able to evolve in GLC because Corphish is a pure water type, but we do have Zoroark that can cheat this card out of the discard pile, and in the next set we're getting a supporter that can cheat Darkness Pokemon into play as well. We're also getting a Stage 1 Toxtricity that can accelerate Darkness energy from the deck and also puts 2 damage counters on that Pokemon. So if you can get Crawdaunt into play with Toxtricity in play, you essentially have a 0 energy attacker doing 130 damage, which is not bad. The card is unplayable though until then. I'll just quickly talk about the Spiritomb. Don't play this, play the good Spiritomb instead. Put a Rocky Helmet in your deck if you really want this kind of effect. Anguish Cry Spiritomb is just so strong as a basic single energy attacker. There's just no way you can justify cutting that card for this when you have so many ways in GLC to replicate this. Lightning also got pretty shafted this set. We got another Raikou that is again stuck doing 120 damage tied to a kind of tough hoop to jump through, needing 4 energy in play for a 2 energy attack that does 120. So throw this one on the pile with the other Raikous that do 120 damage. I fully support the amazing Raikou ban, but I do hope we eventually get a good Raikou to replace it. Raikou is one of my favorites. Also, someone at TPCI really loves making Magnezone cards for some reason, and they just keep making bad ones. Please stop making more Magnezones. We already have 2 good ones. We don't need more bad ones. Dragon has been getting lots of support lately, so I won't lament this one too much, but I just wanted to point out that had they chopped off the 3rd colorless energy requirement on this card, it most likely would not have affected its usefulness in Standard in any way. But it would have been so much more interesting for GLC and been a great new option, both for building Psychic-based Dragon decks and for Red Assist Latias decks. But alas, it seems they didn't want to risk this lowly single prizer ever outshining its Mega Evolution sister by attacking a Mega Evolution that isn't even an evolution card at all. Like, come on, what even is this? Incredibly, Fairy is getting the same amount of useful new cards in this set as colorless. And that's because colorless players got nothing from this set. That's right, colorless players. For once, you get nothing, and you'll like it. Drink up. And that's it. So, how good was Mega Evolution actually? No, wait, that's the wrong channel. So how good do you think Mega Evolution will be in GLC? Were there any cards you thought I missed that should have been included? Any cards I mentioned you think I was wrong about? Please let me know in the comments. By the way, it's been a year now as of September 5th since I started this channel. Just want to say thank you to everyone who watches my videos and comments and engages with the channel, everyone who subscribes and helps the channel grow. It has been a really fun year doing GLC TV videos, and now that I'm in a completely different state, I don't know what the future will bring, but I'm going to keep making videos for GLC whenever I can. See you next time. On the Ice Dance Frosmoth. But of course, you have access to other rain. Of course, you have access to Azra. Can I talk? Have access to other rain dancers in water that you could use instead of